Stakeholders engagement for investment project. Stakeholders engagement for investment project. That's what we're looking at. This is a repeat model because this model was earlier done on this webinar, but somehow we got some feedback that some persons missed it. So we decided to run this again. So we'll run as much as possible to be able to capture the key issues as highlighted, as you can see. So stakeholder engagement, like we said severally, that is an ongoing process that starts during the planning stage of a project all the way throughout the life cycle of the project. It's an ongoing process that may involve, in varying degrees, stakeholder analysis and planning, disclosure and dissemination of information, consultation and participation, grievance mechanism, reporting to affected communities. So the nature and frequency and level of effort of stakeholder engagement may vary considerably and will be commensurate in most cases with the project's risk and adverse impacts and the project's phase of development. So we will be capturing all of this at this time, and I do hope that it will meet the needs of our members, of our participants on this webinar. Okay, so stakeholders analysis and planning. We have here interested stakeholders identification, stakeholder engagement planning, that's SEP, and stakeholder engagement framework, SEF. So generally, clients or proponents or investors should identify the range of stakeholders that may be interested in their actions and consider how external communications might facilitate a dialogue with all stakeholders. Where projects involve specifically identified physical elements, aspects or facilities that are likely to generate adverse environmental and social impacts to affected communities, the clients will identify the affected communities and will meet the relevant requirements described, in the local laws or in the international laws. It depends on, in some cases, you have the International Finance Corporation requesting for an intensive stakeholder engagement analysis and planning. So it depends on the borrower or the lender's requirement for specific projects. So the clients will develop and implement a stakeholder engagement plan that is scaled to the project risks and impacts and developmental stages, each stage of the project, and be tailored to the characteristics and interests of the affected communities where applicable. So the SEP will include differentiated measures to allow the effective participation of those identified as disadvantaged or vulnerable groups. Because in some communities we had an experience where in a community there were majority vulnerable groups which we categorized as the blind people, the lame people, women, and children. Specifically, women were not allowed to talk to us. Women were not allowed to, that's in Nigeria, women were not allowed to go to the public to make statements or to give us audience at all. But in the process, we're able to get them involved and get them engaged and capture their views and make sure that they are fully integrated in the process. So the disadvantaged people or the vulnerable people will be captured during the stakeholders engagement planning as they are affected. Okay, so when the stakeholder engagement process depends sustainably on community representative, then the client will make every reasonable effort to verify that such persons do represent the views of affected communities and that they can be relied upon to faithfully communicate the results of consultation of their constituents. So I can see a question here saying who can represent during SEP. Well, depending on the way the community is structured. Sometimes when we work in communities, we try to check out their culture. We try to, as much as possible, respect their culture. We try to ask them questions so that you don't go offending them in the process of executing your project, because it happens a lot of time. So uh, as to who can represent, we try to ensure that, like I mentioned earlier, the vulnerable people or the disadvantaged people are well represented. But in most communities, you see that is the chiefs. Like in Nigeria, you have the chiefs or the obas uh, if it's in the Yoruba speaking area. Sometimes you have the Meangwas if it is the Hausa speaking areas. So uh, most cases, they have selections of people to represent them during the stakeholders engagement. But we like to make sure that the disclosure and the engagement process carries along almost every group in the community. So we got to tell them. There was a meeting I went, and we had planned, we had informed them, we had done a lot of sensitization that we're coming to talk about the project to the communities. And when we got there, we saw just men in the hall, more than 100 of them, men in the hall. So we started to worry. Being a lady, of course, I said, where are the women? We can't start this meeting without the women. So they started laughing. They said, well, in this place, women don't come out to talk to you. I said, okay, that means I can talk to you too, since I'm a woman. So we started laughing and cracking jokes in that direction. And eventually, they brought out the women for us to talk to them. And wow, it was revealing all of the issues that could have gone quiet if we were talking to men, was brought to the limelight. So stakeholder analysis and stakeholder planning has to capture the vulnerable groups. They have to be represented. The men group can be represented, the women group can be represented, the youths can be represented, the farmers can be represented, the disabled people can be represented. As much as possible, we like to have these groups represented during the process, okay? So that's question, I picked that question because it's most relevant to what we're talking about. So in cases where the exact location of the project is not known, but is reasonably expected to have significant impacts on communities, uh, we'll have to prepare the SEF, that's the Stakeholder Engagement Framework. Why? Because the project location is not known. The precise project location is not known, but as to the state or the country, it's known already. So the SEP is part of a management program. I mean, SEF is part of a management program outlining general principles and strategies to identify affected communities and other relevant stakeholders and plan for an engagement process compatible with the standards or the regulations of a country that will be implemented once the physical location of the project is known. Okay, so let's move forward. Disclosure and dissemination. Don't forget we are capturing this 5 bullets points. So we move forward to disclosure. Number 2, disclosure and dissemination of information. So at this stage, just like the name implies, I mean, the statement implies, the disclosure of relevant project information helps the affected communities and other stakeholders to understand the risk, the impact, and opportunities of the project. The clients have to provide affected communities with access to relevant information. We had a particular project where the community didn't know about the project, or they knew about the project to some extent, but not to a large extent. They didn't know about the impact. They only knew that a project was coming up, but they didn't have details as to the risk and the impact of the project. They only knew about the opportunities. So the disclosure and the dissemination of information is critically important for the survival of the project and for the sake of having a social license for your project. They have to know that air quality will be impacted, that their normal lifestyles will be impacted, that their health facilities cannot take the influx of persons that will come in because of the project, and so on and so forth. So the risk, the impact, and the opportunities. that a project brings have to be disclosed to the affected communities. And depending on the scale of the project and significance of such risk, relevant documents can be very, very useful, for the process. So you can have, like we have discussed, the SEP, the Stakeholders Engagement Plan. You can also have the Resettlement Action Plan, because in some projects, you have to resettle people from their original states of inhabitation to another location. In most cases, their lands are taken, their farmlands are taken, their livelihood, of course, is tampered with. So there are plans that have to be developed in the process of the stakeholders' engagement. So resettlement action plan is one of them. If they are going to be resettled, how many people are going to be resettled, from where to where? If you're buying their lands, how much is it going to go for? We have the government rates and the market rates. It's most advisable to go for the market rates, but all of this have been captured in the stakeholder engagement process and during the disclosure and dissemination of information. If this is not properly done, or it's not done at all, and the project gets to the stage where it has to commence and people's land are being trampled upon, there are going to be issues that can hamper the implementation of the project, and in the long run it can cause chaos, and if investments are done already, investments can be lost in the process. Same way, you have the biodiversity action plan, which should be considered depending on the risk level or the scale of the project. The scale of the project. Okay, I'm trying to check out which points we're on, and I'm seeing some questions that are coming in. Your questions are distracting me, but we'll try to look at those questions and answer them later on. So biodiversity action plan has to be checked if biodiversity will be tampered with, like I said. So, and in cases where the livelihood of persons will be tampered with during the project implementation, they have to be told during the disclosure process. Even if you have paid for a land, perhaps there is a big farm, maybe a plantation, and you're buying over the plantation for the sake of the project, and the owner of the land has been compensated. You have to think about the workers on the farm. What's happened to them? Are they going to lose their livelihood? And then in that case, you have to have a livelihood restoration plan in place, and so on. So the affected communities have to be provided with access to this nature of information. That is the purpose, nature, and scale of the project, the duration of the proposed project activity, any risks and potential impact on the communities, and the relevant mitigation measures we are looking to apply. This has to be captured in your documents and also made expressly clear or expressly disclosed to the communities. Okay, and even the grievance mechanism has to be discussed with the communities at length, so that they will know the approach by which the grievances can be captured. In some cases, you have overlap of ownership of lands and there will be grievances. There should be an organized fashion where these grievances will be properly captured and dealt with, so that the right thing will be done according to the standard regulations. In the case of the IFC, according to the performance standards. Okay, so we capture this consultation and participation. When affected communities are subject to identified risks and adverse impacts from the project, the proponent will undertake a process of consultation in the manner that provides the communities with opportunities to also express their views on the risk that have been made clear to them, on the impacts, on the mitigation measures, and also to allow, and also the proponents have to consider these views of the communities and respond to them in a proper manner. So the extent and degree of engagement required by the consultation process should be commensurate with the project's risk and adverse impact with the concerns raised by the affected communities. So effective consultation is a two-way process. It's at the beginning, it begins early, like I said in the introduction. It begins early in the process of identification. It begins early in the process of planning. So you have to begin early so that environmental and social risks and impacts are continued to be disclosed to the communities. Okay, so effective consultation should also be based on the prior disclosure and dissemination of relevant, transparent, objective, meaningful, and easily accessible information, which is in a culturally appropriate language. If it's Kanuri, you speak Kanuri. If it's Hausa, you speak Hausa. If it's Igbo, you speak Igbo. If it's the Ghanaian language, you speak the Ghanaian language. How the people can understand clearly what you're communicating to them. So it should, the two-way process should also focus on groups, like I said in the introduction. You have the women, the elderly, the youth, the displaced, the disadvantaged groups, and all that. And it should be free of manipulations. In most cases, we have, some slight manipulations here and there. It should be free of manipulation, interferences, coercion, or intimidation. It should enable meaningful participation, and it should be documented. The processes should be documented in pictures, in minutes of meetings, in views capturing what question was asked and how it was answered, and all that. So informed consultation and participation, that's a bullet point we have there. For projects with potentially significant adverse impact, the proponent will conduct an informed consultation and participation, let me say ICP process, that will build upon the steps outlined in my previous discussion in consultation with the communities. So the consultation process should capture both men's and women's view, if necessary, through separate forums of engagements, because like I said earlier, some communities do not allow women to speak, and that may be their culture. So what needs to be done is to separate the women from the men and still capture the opinions of these two different groups. Okay, so also the process should reflect men's and women's different concerns and priority about the impact, the mitigation mechanisms, and benefits where appropriate. So the proponent will document the process, in particular the measures taken to avoid or minimize risk, minimize risks and adverse impacts on the communities, and will inform those affected about how their concerns have been considered. So we have the consultation process, indigenous people. That's for projects with adverse impacts to indigenous people. The proponent is required to engage them in a process of ICP, and in certain circumstances, the client is required to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent. The requirements related to indigenous peoples and the definition of the special circumstances requiring the free, prior, and informed consent are described in the IFC Performance Standard 5. So let me quickly take your question, and then we come back to tackle the concerns as seen. I see a lot of concerns here. Let's deal with them so that we can move on as fast as possible, and we should leave nobody